There I was at camp. It was Friday, and it had been a great week. I'd even convinced some of the younger kids that I was a camp counselor throughout my leadership and fun. I was going to be a sophomore in high school that fall, and had been going to camp every year since the fourth grade. I loved it. I had grown up in a little Lutheran church outside of Cannon Falls, and they sent campers to camp every year. When I was young, I felt like my dad made me go to church, but as I grew older, it was me making my dad go to church. But it was great. It was somewhere where I belonged. I guess I've always believed in God, and when I was 6 years old, my evangelical cousins had me accept Jesus into my heart, but I'm pretty sure he was already there. My pastor came up to me that Friday at camp during lunch and asked me a question. It wasn't too complicated of a question, and I didn't have too complicated of an answer, but at the same time it was a defining question. It was a question that, if answered correctly, my life would spin into a whole new direction. My pastor asked me if I wanted to come back next week. And it doesn't seem like much, but it is much because I said yes, and then my whole entire life was headed this direction, but then boom, it went that direction. I went back the next week to the Youth Servant Leadership Institute. In that week, I told myself that I wanted to do ministry. Before, I'd known that I wanted to be a camp counselor, but I wasn't sure what beyond that. But then, that week, I knew it was ministry. I didn't know if I was going to be a pastor or a youth pastor, but now it's a youth pastor. That week, we explored who we were individually and what gifts we'd been given. We served and built walls for a Habitat house. We grew and learned as a team of growing youth who eventually became more than a team of growing youth. We became a family. I think back on it now and I see that it was the affinity of the group that really pulled me in. It was caring and relational ministry that my pastor and the camp provided for us and helped me develop vocationally before I even knew what the word vocation meant. This week instilled something bigger in me. Something that I couldn't understand then, but now it's so clear that the Holy Spirit was there working and saying, Zach, this is what you need to be doing in life. Through this program, I met people that I would never have met, and then set my life into a whole new direction. These people introduced me into a program called Teens Encounter Christ, or TECH. For me, TECH showed me that God loved me more than anything. At every one of the 8 techs that I worked, you could feel his energy and presence in the room. The most specific time I remember is when I shared my faith story. It was quite different than it is today, but God was there that time when I shared my faith story. He was there in the tears and in the hugs that followed my story, my talk. And I mean this in the most humble way possible, but through my story that weekend, people told me that they believed in God now as a result of what I had done. Truly, God was there. It wasn't me, it was God, and He was working through me, and He was alive in that room that day that I gave my talk. Through TECH, I was also exposed to people whom I don't share the same beliefs with. I mean, we're both Christians, or we're all Christians, but not always the same beliefs. And so through that, I've engaged in theological discussions and many conversations that have challenged me to figure out what I really do believe. And not only figure out what I believe, but also figure out how to validate them. God has been in more places than just these places that are built in just encouraging of God to be in my life, because God's everywhere. My friends and I once climbed an abandoned grain elevator over on the campus of the University of Minnesota. We climbed and we climbed up into the old rickety staircases, internal and external of the building. To be honest, there was a noose hanging in there, and it kind of gave me the the chills, and there was even a cat that was running around stray. We got to the top floor, and it was pretty cool. We saw the light coming through the broken windows, and you could see the city of Minneapolis through it. It was beautiful. But it got even better. We looked up inside this grain elevator belt thing, conveyor belt. We looked up in there, and we saw a light coming through. Within seconds, I was climbing the belt, and I poked my head through the hole. Boom! Life, light, and wind hit me. I was on top of the world. I climbed up and sat on the roof, and my friends followed me. A high hit me like nothing I'd ever had before. One of the mountaintop experiences that I look back on. My arms were covered in goosebumps. A tear came to my eye. The city of Minneapolis shined like a beacon. The wind soared through my hair, and I sat and I stared. Next to me, God sat. He sat there and said, "This is life. This is amazing. This is what I can do." It was bigger and better than Mufasa showing Simba. Everything in the land that he could see was theirs. Everything that the light touched. But it gets better than that. I got to spend one of the best moments of my life sitting with my two best friends. We sat there in awe of what the Lord had done. And we talked about life and how we had changed throughout the year of knowing each other, how we had grown in friendship with another. The most spiritual night of recent times is when the night of my favorite metal band was in town. It was the most crowded room that I've ever been in. I'm sure I was touching like 7 other people at all times, but it was the crowdedness that made me feel like I belonged. It was the crowdedness that showed the Holy Spirit to me. The lyric, "We sing for you, we sing for you, we sing for you," is the most memorable moment of that night. 700 people screaming at the top of their lungs, "We sing for you." We sing for God, is what we were saying. Because you wouldn't know it going to the show, but maybe by the end, you'd pick up on it that August Burns Red, my favorite metal band, happens to be Christian as well. God continues to show up more in my life now that I am always keeping an eye out for him. God freezes the Minnehaha Falls, and he stays behind them and within them. God was my friend Dan on the worst night of recent memory. And Dan stopped by just to say hey and kind of hang out for a little bit. God resides within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and he shines his light through every person on this planet. Last October, I interviewed for a part-time youth minister position. I personally felt it went really well, but then I never really heard back from the guy who interviewed me. I tried to contact him to check up on the status of the position, but he didn't respond. Well, until a month and a half later, he invited me to come and hang out at confirmation, and so I did. And I thought that went well too, but then again, I didn't hear from him for like 4 weeks after that. One evening, while I was on Christmas break, I got an email. It was from the pastor I interviewed with. He informed me that he would love for me to work at his church. It was real. It was actually happening. I was officially a youth minister, and I still am. And I hope I never, ever, ever have to stop being a youth minister. But God didn't just give this to me. He taught me many lessons. 7 months ago, I didn't even want to be anything related to ministry. I'd changed my mind, I'd backed out, I'd gotten some cold feet.